הנה הנה לא ינום ולא יישן, לא ינום ולא יישן, שומע ישראל. הנה הנה לא ינום ולא יישן, לא ינום ולא יישן, שומע ישראל. השם לא יבנה בית, שלום לא בואי נבואי, אם השם לא ישמע לי, שוב שוקת שוימר. אם השם לא יבנה בית, שלום לא בואי נבואי, אם השם לא ישמע לי, שוב שוקת שוימר. אם השם לא יבנה בית, שלום לא בואי נבואי, אם השם לא ישמע לי, שוב שוקת שוימר. אם השם לא יבנה בית, שלום לא בואי נבואי, אם השם לא ישמע לי, שוב שוקת שוימר.
How great is that? Love those guys. That is the Shira choir singing the first verse of Psalm 127. Im Hashem lo yivne bayis shav am luboinav bo. Unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? Let's light up the darkness. All right, we've got a lot of work to do tonight. We're doing a double daf, a double show, 2 pages. We are going to be covering who is with us on this fine Wednesday night. Melissa says good evening from Great Neck, New York. Paula from Chicago. Guy from Dayton, Ohio. Harold from Roseburg, Oregon. Sharon from Lebanon, New Jersey. Patricia says Lila Tove from Chicago. If this is your first time tuning in, let us know so we can welcome you. Bill says that today's page sounds interesting from the title. Nancy with us from North Carolina. Allison from Fayetteville, North Carolina. Jacob from Nebraska. Deborah from Miami Beach. And then it skipped on me. There we go. Deborah from Miami Beach. James from Indianapolis. Pam from Nashville. Stephanie says amen. Charles says shalom in New Mexico. Chaim from Charlotte. Donna is with us from Bahama, North Carolina. Great to see you, Donna. Susie from Las Vegas and Carlos from South Jersey. And Michael Botek is in from Queens, New York City. Over on the YouTube side, Lynn from North Texas. Linda from North Texas. Wow. And Lindsay from Cincinnati. It's great to have you all here. Okay, what's going on tonight? We are in chapter 6 of Tractate Eruvin, the 3rd volume of the Talmud. Today we're going to be doing a double daf, pages 72 and 73. We're going to be starting and completing our discussion of Mishnah number 4 and Mishnah number 5, and we're going to open our discussion of Mishnah number 6. We've been discussing the need to form an eruv when several residents share a courtyard, right? When there's several residences in a courtyard, the people who live in those residences, because the houses are private but the courtyard is shared, they're not going to be able to carry something from their house out into the courtyard or from the courtyard into their house on Shabbos or even around the courtyard more than 4 cubits unless all of the residences, and it really doesn't have to be every person who lives in the courtyard, it's all of the residences, right? If people share a house, okay, it's enough for one of them to contribute to the eruv, and that's what we're going to be discussing as well. But the idea is that all of the homes in the courtyard have to contribute to this eruv, contribute some food into a joint basket of food, as it were, and that's going to permit them to carry objects in and out of their houses on Shabbos. Otherwise, they would be violating the prohibition of carrying something on Shabbos from a private domain to a public domain. The shared courtyard isn't really a public domain, but in the time of King Solomon, they decreed that a shared courtyard is like a public domain, and that's why they have to join in the eruv, making a symbolic joining of all the houses in that courtyard into one residence, as it were. Today, we're discussing what constitutes a residence. So far, we've just been assuming, okay, well, there's a house, the people who live in there, that's their residence. But now, as we'll see, it's not so simple. What is a residence? So we open by discussing Mishna, by reading Mishnah number 4, and then we will discuss it. All right, let me make sure I have it here. Okay, so the 4th Mishnah of chapter 6 here in Tractate Eruvin. With regard to 5 groups of people who spent Shabbos in one teraklin, okay? And so teraklin is a hall. So it's some kind of a building. That's the key here. It's a building with a large space inside that was subdivided by partitions into separate rooms, each of which had a separate entrance to a courtyard that was shared with other houses. Beis Shammai say an eruv is required, meaning a contribution to the eruv of the courtyard, is required for each and every group that's in this hall, in these spaces within the hall that are divided by partitions. And Beis Hillel say one contribution to the eruv suffices for all the 5 groups of people who are in this hall. And Beis Hillel concede that when some of them occupy separate rooms or upper stories, they require a separate eruv for each and every group, and one contribution for all of them will not suffice. That is the Mishnah. So let me just get my notes in front of me. All right, so the question is, these people who share this space, and this is the key. They share this building, and in the rooms inside this building, they each have exits out into the courtyard, right? So if they were all walking through the same exit, then for sure this whole building would count as one residence, and no matter how many people were in it, they would all join in just making one contribution on behalf of that house to the eruv for the courtyard in which this building sits, and shares that courtyard with some other buildings, some other residences, okay? But because there are partitions and entrances within this building, the question is, do these partitions turn this building into an apartment building that essentially has 5 separate apartments in it, 5 different residences in it? Or are the partitions between these various spaces in the hall not significant enough to require these 5 groups of people to have to make separate contributions to the courtyard eruv? That's what we're discussing. How significant do these partitions have to be so that we think of this not as one house with a bunch of people in it, but rather as a kind of apartment building that has 5 separate residences within it. Okay, so Rav Nachman comments on this Mishnah that, and so Beis Shammai say that depending on how we're going to define this, Beis Shammai are going to be more stringent and require the 5 groups to make separate contributions, and Beis Hillel are going to say one contribution is enough for all of them. So Rav Nachman is going to comment on this. Okay, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel only have a dispute if the partitions are made of pegs, right? So Rav Nachman's initial comment is, okay, the dispute between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is that the walls are very flimsy, right? Made of pegs. It's almost like you could imagine that the partitions between the spaces are really just made of rods, almost like if you're looking through the railing along a stairway and, there's some vertical posts like every few inches, and you can easily see right through the partitions. They're very unsubstantial. And according to this reading of the Mishnah, the way Rav Nachman is starting our discussion of it, he's saying that Beis Shammai, who are stringent, are so stringent that even if you could just look right through these partitions, Beis Shammai would still require separate contributions to the courtyard eruv for the 5 groups inside this building. And Beis Hillel would say, no, the spaces are sort of symbolically separated, but it's really all one space within this building, and one contribution to the courtyard eruv will be enough. Rabbi Hiya and Rabbi Shimon, the son of Rebbe, add the next two commentaries on this Mishnah. The first one says, the dispute only exists if the partitions, and by the way, when we say partitions, the word for that is mechitza. Usually, where's the word mechitza used commonly in modern times? Among people that aren't so well educated in Talmud and Hebrew, etc. The word mechitza is commonly used when we talk about in an Orthodox synagogue, the partition between the men's side and the women's side. But the word just means partition, and it's the same word no matter what kinds of spaces we're dividing. And in fact, throughout this Masechta, throughout this volume of the Talmud on eruv, we've often talked about enclosing spaces with partitions, and the word for that is mechitza, right? In plural, mechitzos, because it's a feminine word. At any rate, so the dispute between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, according to this next commentary, is only in the case that the mechitzos, the partitions, reach the ceiling, right? So the dispute is only if the mechitzos reach the ceiling. If they don't reach the ceiling, according to this view, everybody agrees that it's just one space. So now you can sort of have in your mind, like in a workplace where people have cubicles, right? And so the walls of the cubicles don't go up to the ceiling, right? They go at least 10 handbreadths high, which is like waist high, or even you can imagine a little higher, but they don't go to the ceiling. So it's clearly all one big room. And these partitions, now they're not made of pegs. They're definitely sturdy. They're not flexible. You can't see through them, but they don't go to the ceiling. So according to this first view of the next set of commentaries, if they don't go to the ceiling, then everybody agrees that this is all one space and one contribution to the courtyard eruv is going to be enough. But if the partitions do go to the ceiling, then that's where we have the dispute between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai meaning the Academy of Shammai, generally more stringent than Beis Hillel, the Academy of Hillel. Then if the partitions do go to the ceiling, then the dispute is Beis Shammai say all the groups have to make separate contributions, and Beis Hillel would even allow one contribution from everybody if these partitions made it up to the ceiling. That's probably Rabbi Hiya's view. Rabbi Shimon, the son of Rebbe, says no. The dispute between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is only if the mechitzas, the partitions, do not reach the ceiling. If they do reach the ceiling, then everybody agrees that this is, you've created separate rooms, right? There are walls that go from floor to ceiling, dividing these spaces. And even if they're not made of stone and they're not permanent in nature, because they're partitions, rather than walls, nevertheless, they're dividing the spaces completely. There's no gap between the top of the partition and the ceiling. So all would agree that in that case, you don't have to, the 5 different groups in their 5 different spaces need to make separate contributions to the courtyard eruv. But if the partitions don't make it to the ceiling, that's where we have the dispute between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. And Beis Shammai would say they do have to make separate contributions, just as in the case where the partitions reach the ceiling. And Beis Hillel say, well, now that they don't reach the ceiling, they're only like cubicles, right, in a workplace. Now we can think of this all as one space. And even though there's 5 groups of people and spaces separated by these partitions that don't reach the ceilings, one contribution to the courtyard eruv, right? This building is in a courtyard, sharing a courtyard with some other residences. So this one building, one contribution to the courtyard eruv from all the people within it is enough. Rabbi Yehuda the Keen. Wouldn't that be a great nickname to have? He has such a keen intellect, K-E-E-N, that he's known as Rabbi Yehuda the Keen. So Rabbi Yehuda the Keen says, all agree that separate contributions are needed if the mechitzas reach the ceiling. And if the mechitzas do not reach the ceiling, then that is where the dispute lies between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Beis Hillel say that one is sufficient, and Beis Shammai say they still need separate contributions, like the second view probably attributed to Rabbi Shimon, the son of Rebbe. And it seems like Rabbi Yehuda the Keen is backing up that view of what exactly is the dispute between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel in our Mishnah. Now Rav Nachman says the dispute applies even when the walls are made of pegs, meaning walls that don't reach the ceiling. And still, Beis Hillel would say, Rav Nachman is saying the dispute applies even if the walls are made out of pegs, meaning that the partitions are made out of pegs. They're very flimsy. You can see right through them, and they don't reach the ceiling. And Beis Shammai would still require separate contributions from each group in those 5 spaces within the building. But then the Gemara says, no, actually, what Rav Nachman is teaching is that the dispute applies even when the walls are not made out of pegs, that they are sturdy. And wait, let me make sure I get this right. When non-mesifos to teach that Beis Shammai allow one contribution, even for, okay, and he's saying, I think I've got this wrong, but I think he would be suggesting that that Beis Hillel are going to allow one, even in the case of sturdy walls that do reach the ceiling, because what he wants to get at is the leniency of Beis Hillel's position. So first, let me just teach what the halacha actually is. The halacha is brought down by Rav, and it accords with Rabbi Yehuda the Keen. The issue is whether the mechitzas reach the ceiling. If they do, then a separate contribution is going to need to be made. If the mechitzas do not reach the ceiling, then even if they're sturdy and not kind of see-through and flimsy, one contribution will do, according to the view of Beis Hillel. All agree that if partitions reach the ceiling, they all need to make separate contributions. If they don't reach the ceiling, then even if they're sturdy partitions, one contribution to the courtyard eruv is going to be enough for these 5 groups who could really be very separated, right? I mean, if you think about that these partitions could go near the ceiling and be totally solid, it would seem like they're real, and they have separate exits and entrances from their building out into the courtyard. You really could see Beis Shammai's position that they should make, it's like they're separate residences, and therefore they should make separate contributions out there to the courtyard eruv. But the leniency is strong, and we follow the leniency of Beis Hillel. And on this subject of why Rav Nachman is focusing on the leniency, Rav Steinsaltz comments, it is preferable to teach us the strength of the leniency. The basis for this statement is that a Tana, one of the old rabbis of the early generation before the Mishnah was compiled, sometimes has to decide between formulating a dispute in a manner that emphasizes the strength of the stringent position or one that emphasizes the strength of the lenient position, right? Which is to say, even in a case that blah, 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 we're going to go such and such. And what he's emphasizing is how lenient the lenient position is. Why, if we're not sure what's being emphasized, the stringency or the leniency, are we going to have a sort of a bias to interpret it that the rabbi was trying to emphasize the strength of the leniency? The reason is stringencies often arise from doubt. Meaning when we're not sure exactly how to rule, and we can't get right in there with a very sharp logic and understand exactly what the ruling should be, well, then the rabbis are gonna head toward the stringent position. Not because they've really figured it out, but just in case, right? The stringent position in a rabbinic decree is gonna protect the people who follow it from coming to make a mistake and violating a Torah prohibition by mistake. It's easier for a halakhic authority, for a rabbi making a Torah ruling, it's easier for him to issue a stringent ruling. It's more protective, it's easier to do. And it is a bigger challenge and requires, in a sense, a sharper understanding of the law and the question at hand to issue a lenient ruling. So when a lenient ruling is in there, the rabbis will tend to emphasize why the lenient ruling was given so that we understand it, so that their students understand it, so that everybody understands it, and to show how sharp the Torah authority was who arrived at the lenient position, right? It's riskier for a rabbi to give a lenient ruling because, it's like people come a little bit closer to that edge of what's prohibited. But if the lenient ruling is the correct ruling, of course they have to give it. They just have to be very careful about how they issue the lenient ruling, lest people come to rely on it and make an error as they're relying on it and step over the line and violate a Torah prohibition. Okay. And what does the Mishnah mean when it says in the second part of the Mishnah that Beis Hillel concede if one or more of these groups of people in this shared building occupy rooms or upper stories? So the Gemara is asking that question because it seems obvious. If people are occupying a room, not just a space that's set off with partitions, but rather a room that has its own entrance or exit to the court, has its own, entrance to the courtyard, then for sure that would count as a separate residence. Or if they occupied an upper story, meaning like it was another apartment on the second story, for sure that would be a separate residence. So proper apartment buildings for sure constitute multiple residences in a courtyard, and each of the apartments would have to contribute to the courtyard eruv. But since that's obvious, why does the Mishnah say that Beis Hillel concede in the case of rooms and upper stories? And the answer is because this doesn't come to teach us about other rooms and upper floors. It really is coming to teach us the same lesson as the first part of the Mishnah, that if the partitions reach the ceiling, then it's like a separate room. If the partition reaches the ceiling, it's like an upper story, an upper floor in the building. And all agree that even if the partitions reach the ceiling, but the courtyard eruv is being stored in this building, then one contribution is going to be sufficient for all of them. So that just turned the whole thing around. Wait a minute. These are all separate residences if the partitions reach the ceiling, so they have to make separate contributions to the courtyard eruv, right? Because this is only one building in the courtyard. Now we know there's at least one other building in this courtyard and maybe more. But when you make an eruv in a courtyard, right, the different residences in that courtyard have to contribute some food into the joint vessel, let's say a basket, and then that basket is going to be stored in one of the residences in that courtyard. If it's stored in another residence, not the one where these 5 groups of people are, then the question is, how do they each have to make separate contributions? And if the partitions reach the ceiling, yes, they each have to make separate contributions. But if the basket of food for the courtyard is being stored in this building, then since these are spaces separated by partitions and not proper walls, right? They're partitions that reach the ceiling, but they're not really separate apartments. So then one is going to be enough, one contribution from this whole building, because the eruv is in that building with them. I don't know that it makes total sense, but that is the ruling. Mishnah number 5. Let's read that. Mishnah number 5. In the case of brothers who were eating at their father's table and sleeping in their own houses in the same courtyard, a separate contribution to the eruv is required for each and every one of them, of the brothers. Therefore, if one of them forgot and did not contribute to the eruv of the courtyard, he must be mevatel his rights, right? He must renounce his rights in the courtyard in order to render carrying in the courtyard permitted on Shabbos for all the other residents of the courtyard. Now, when do they state this halacha, this law? They state it when they take their eruv elsewhere in the courtyard. In other words, the basket of food is going to be deposited in one of the other residences in this courtyard. But if the eruv was coming to them, i.e., if it was placed in their father's house, or if there are no other residents with the brothers and their father in the courtyard, then they are not required to make separate contributions to the eruv or to make any contributions. Their father's contribution is enough, or if there's no other residents, no eruv needs to be made because they are considered like a single individual living in a courtyard. All right, so let's just repeat that. So the Mishnah is saying that we've got a courtyard, and there's going to be two different cases here. In the first case, there's a father lives in his house, and he's got two grown sons who each live in a separate house in the courtyard. So there's three houses that belong to this family. The father has his house, and the grown sons, let's say two of them, have their own houses in the courtyard. And there's someone else, some other family also has a house. So minimally, there's 4 houses in the courtyard. 1 belongs to the father, 2 belong to each of the sons, and then there's a 4th house that just belongs to some other family. And it says that the 2 sons eat from their father's table, and there's going to be an eruv made for this courtyard, and the basket of the eruv is going to be stored in the house of that other family, the 4th house with this other family. And so the question is, do the brothers who live in their own houses but who eat at their father's table, do they have to make their own contributions on behalf of their own house where they sleep into that courtyard eruv, and that basket is being stored in the 4th house, right? In the house of this other family that shares a courtyard with them. And the second case is that there is no 4th house. There's only the father's house and the 2 sons living in that courtyard. And in that case, they don't have to make a separate eruv, okay? Or if it's the first case, there's 4 houses, including this other family, but the basket for the eruv is being kept in the father's house, then again, just like the 5 groups of people in that hall in the Mishnah number 4, if the basket is being stored in the hall, they don't have to make separate contributions to it, even if the partitions between them went up to the ceiling. And here, even if the basket is being stored in if the basket is being stored in the father's house, then the sons don't have to make their own separate contributions. They only have to do that when the basket is being stored in that 4th house in the courtyard. Okay. That's Mishnah number 5. So, brothers who eat at their father's table are a little bit like the partners in that food business deal that we saw in Mishnah number 3, right? Where there were 3 houses in a courtyard, and they forgot to make an eruv for that courtyard. But it turned out that one of the owners of the 3 houses in that courtyard had business deals with the other people in that courtyard. They co-owned some wine. And so even though they didn't make an eruv, the fact that they own some wine together, which is a food, it's the kind of thing that you can make an eruv out of, allowed them to rely on that joint ownership of the wine, which is being stored in the house, in one of those houses in the courtyard, to act as the eruv. It's almost like a virtual eruv. They didn't intend to make an eruv, but it works as an eruv because they co-own food that's being stored in one of the houses. So here, the fact that the sons eat at their father's table sort of counts as living in the same house with him. They don't live in the same house with him, but the fact that they eat at his table seems to count. Well, hold on a second. The fact they eat at the father's table, but they sleep in their own houses. So it seems like even though they eat at their father's table, the fact that they sleep in their own house means that they have a separate residence, and therefore they need to contribute independently to the courtyard eruv, as long as that basket of food is being stored not in dad's house, not in the brothers' houses, but over in that fourth house that belongs to somebody else. Therefore, says the Gemara, it must be that where a person sleeps determines his residence for purposes of Shabbos and eruv. Where a person sleeps is where his home is, says the Gemara. Right? So we just learned that they eat by their father's table, but they have to make a separate contribution to the eruv. It must be that because they sleep in their own houses, that determines that they have a separate residence and they need to make a contribution. Rav Yehuda says in the name of Rav, no. That's not what this Mishnah is teaching. Because actually what's going on in the Mishnah is that it's not that they eat at the father's table every night. It's that the father supports them. The father gives them food, but they eat it in their own house. Right? So this is a case, wealthy father, the boys, let's say, are still students. They live in a separate building in the courtyard, but they receive their food from their father, but they eat it in their own house. So we can't learn out from the fact that they have to make an independent contribution to the courtyard eruv that we consider a person's residence to be where he sleeps. Because in this case, they sleep in their own house and they eat in their own house. It's just that the food that they eat is given to them by their father. So now we have a baraisa that's brought in at this point, because now we're trying to sharpen this question. Well, what counts as a residence? Is it where you sleep or is it where you eat? So now we bring in a baraisa that sort of gives us a little bit of information that can help us determine the answer to this question. Is a person's house where he eats or where he sleeps? So the sages taught in a baraisa, one who has a gatehouse or a porch or a balcony in his friend's courtyard does not render the owner of the courtyard prohibited from carrying there without an eruv, as these locations are not considered residences. Now, we're not talking about whether you eat or sleep in this thing, but this kind of a structure, a gatehouse or a balcony or a porch, well, those are just not, they're not enclosed. So they don't count as residences. So even if you sleep and eat there, it still doesn't count as a residence. However, if the person, inhabits a storeroom of straw or a cattle shed or a wood shed or a storehouse in his friend's courtyard, he does render it prohibited for his friend to carry there. Then it does count as a residence. So what we're seeing is a type of structure that has four walls and a roof and a door, no matter what it's used for normally, you can inhabit that, you can sleep and eat in there, and so it would count as a residence. Rabbi Yehuda clarifies this, and he says, only a place of actual dwelling renders it prohibited. So it's not that if you own such a structure in somebody else's courtyard, you're going to have to join the eruv or renounce your rights, or that person's going to be prohibited from carrying in that courtyard on Shabbos. That's only going to happen if you actually live there. And Rabbi Yehuda said there was an incident with a fellow named Ben Napacha. And Ben Napacha was a wealthy guy who owned 5 houses in 5 different courtyards. And the case came before the sages. Does he need to contribute to the eruv in each of those 5 different courtyards, or renounce his rights just for purposes of carrying on Shabbos in each of those courtyards? Or otherwise, the other people who live in those courtyards are going to be prohibited to carry on Shabbos. And the sages said, no. He may own 5 houses, but he only lives in one of them, right? Or at least for any particular Shabbos, he only lives in one of them. So it's the one where he's living that he either has to join the eruv or renounce his rights. And otherwise the people are prohibited to carry. But the fact that he just owns a house, no matter how beautiful a house and how many bedrooms and how nice a dining room, if no one's actually living there, then it doesn't restrict the other residents of the courtyard. So that makes sense. It has to be a dwelling and it has to be dwelled in order to restrict the other people from carrying. Okay? Very good. But we still come back to our question. What counts in the case of the brothers, right? The question was asked, is it that their residence because they sleep in it, or is it their residence because they eat in it? Rav says that your residence for Shabbos is the place where you eat. And Shmuel says your residence in terms of Shabbos is the place where you sleep. So we've got two, heavyweights in the Torah world opining differently, and we're still trying to figure out what counts as your residence, where your bed is or where your dining table is. All right. Shmuel finds support in a Baraisa. The Baraisa teaches that shepherds and fig watchmen, meaning the guards of fig orchards, right, where there's an orchard of fig trees, and the guards and other kinds of guards, right? So these are people who guard properties. But with the situation now, imagine we have like a sort of a small city, and there are fields outside the city and orchards and places where there's a bunch of fig trees, or there's a field, or there's a flock of sheep, and these things need to be guarded, right? But at night, because it's a dangerous part of the world, the guards don't stay out there with the trees and the sheep. At night, they come in the city and they sleep in the city. So they sleep in the city, but they work out in the fields. So the question is, which is their dwelling if it should happen to be, Shabbos? So the shepherds and the watchmen of figs and the guards of fields who sleep in a city but work in the field, from where do we measure their Shabbos boundary? From the city, right? Because the place where they sleep is in the city. However, if they sleep out in the field, right? If it's like near the harvest and the trees are really full of figs or other kinds of fruit, and the sheep, there's a lot of them and it's really dangerous, and like the guard has to be there day and night, and so they sleep out there, and it becomes Shabbos while they're sleeping out there in the field. So then we say their Shabbos boundary, their techem, right? How far they can walk on Shabbos. That's a separate question than carrying on Shabbos in a courtyard. This is an eruv techumen, right? In other words, this is when we talk about eruv of the techem, we say that a person can only walk 2,000 cubits from where he dwells on Shabbos. So where is his dwelling for the purposes of measuring how far he can walk on Shabbos? If he sleeps in the city, his Shabbos dwelling is in the city. If he sleeps out in the fields, his Shabbos dwelling is where he slept. So that would seem to indicate that Shmuel's position, that our dwelling in terms of Shabbos is where we sleep, is the correct position, and that Rav is wrong when he says a dwelling is where a person eats. But the Gemara objects immediately, and he says, okay, these guys who are sleeping out in the field, right? The reason that their techem is going to be measured from where they sleep is because they're eating there too. And if you're going to tell me that they work out there and they sleep out there, but maybe they come into the city to have their meal, then we're going to answer that they would much rather eat where they sleep and work. And so what's dispositive is not where they sleep, but actually where they eat. Even if they have to come into the city to have their meal, that's not their preference, and they think of their dwelling during this particular Shabbos as out there in the field, because that's where they'd like to eat, since they both sleep and have to keep an eye on the sheep there. Okay. Now Rav Yosef says, and so therefore Rav is correct, and the dwelling is where a person eats. Rav Yosef, who we met when we did a Meet the Mensch class last week, said, I have not heard this law. And then his student Abaye says to him, have we seen this before? Abaye says, you taught this to us, right? Rav Yosef had an illness and he lost, even though was kind of the sharpest mind of all of them, the biggest memory of everybody, after he became ill, he lost a part of his memory. Not all of it, but a lot of teachings which he was responsible for transmitting to the next generation and transmitting it so sharply and precisely, he himself forgot. after his illness. And so we often see this kind of thing happening where Abaye will remind Rav Yosef what he taught. And so Abaye says, you taught us that brothers who eat at their father's table must contribute separately to the courtyard eruv. And so we said to you, so therefore it's because they sleep in their own houses. It must be that a person's where he sleeps determines his dwelling for Shabbos. And since they eat at their father's table, but they sleep in their own houses, it must be that where you sleep determines your dwelling. And you, Rav Yosef, said to us, no. The reason that they have to make their separate contributions is because they don't literally eat at their father's table. They just receive their food from their father, but they eat at their own table. And the law is, according to Rav, that where a person eats determines his dwelling for Shabbos. Then there's the question of, we've been talking about brothers. Then a question is brought up, what about slaves and wives, right? So slaves, obviously it's a disgusting practice that offends our sensibility. But in the ancient world, it was a very common, practice. Slavery was widespread. So people owned slaves. In fact, slavery is very, very old. The Jews came when Judaism came along, when the Torah was given. Slavery had already existed for a long time. I mean, obviously the Torah was given at Mount Sinai after the Jews left being enslaved in Egypt for hundreds of years. Slavery was a very old institution. When the Torah was given, it didn't outlaw slavery. It didn't say it is prohibited to own slaves. But what the Torah did, it said that you can't abuse your slaves. So in the ancient world, slavery was basically, it could happen as a result of war. It could also happen as a result of somebody becoming so indebted that they couldn't pay their debts. And so then they would become a slave for a certain amount of time to pay off their debt. But in any case, the Torah came and said, you can't abuse your slaves. Here we have a situation where the slaves occupy their own quarters in a courtyard. And so the question is, okay, well, they, just like the brothers, receive food from their owner, but they eat it in their own house and they sleep in their own house. So do they have to make a separate contribution to the courtyard eruv in order not to restrict people, the other residents of the courtyard, from carrying there? Answer, no. They don't have to make an independent contribution because they're not independent people. They're slaves, they're owned by their master, so he contributes from his residence and they're included in that. What about a man who has multiple wives? Again, offends our modern sensibility, but in the ancient world, it was common. So, these wives, sort of like when we read in the Torah about Leah and Rachel, the wives of Jacob, they each had their own tents, right? And then at times he would go with one of them, or at times he would go with his other wife. But they had their own residence, let's say. So if wives have separate residences in the courtyard, and again, the husband sends them food, but they eat in their own residence and they sleep in their own residence, do they have to make independent contributions to the courtyard eruv? Answer, no. But not because this was a patriarchal system where the husband was understood to own the wife. That was not the reason. The reason that the wives do not need to make independent contributions to the eruv is because the wives are considered to be one person with the husband, even if there are multiple wives. And the example that's given is the case of the levirate marriage, meaning that if there are two brothers and one of them is married, and the one that's married dies before he has children, then there's a Torah obligation that the widow has to, well, she can refuse if she wants to, but the brother, the surviving brother, has an obligation to marry the widow, and the first child that they have together is the heir of the brother who died. It counts as the dead brother's child. So that's called levirate marriage. So if there are multiple wives and the husband dies before any of them have children, then this obligation of his brother to marry them or go through a procedure called chalitza, where he refuses, and then it's a shand, it's an embarrassment to him and the whole family if he refuses. But it's possible to refuse, and certainly the women can refuse. They don't have to do this. But in the ancient world, the presumption would be that the woman would want to do this because it's tough, if you're widowed. But they would all travel together, right? The multiple wives, if none of them had children before their husband died, so the levirate obligation of the dead man's surviving brother is to all of the dead man's wives. So it's like they're all one with the husband, and in case he dies, they remain one, as it were. They can break up if they want to, but they can stay together if they want to as well. Okay, so that was slaves and wives, and they do not need to make separate contributions to the courtyard eruv. The Gemara then asks, what about a disciple of a teacher? Right, so he's neither the wife nor the slave, he's the student of his master, but he lives in the master's courtyard and receives his sustenance from the master, and so he is considered like a wife or a slave. He's a dependent of the master, and even though he lives in a separate residence and eats there and sleeps there, he doesn't have to make an independent contribution to the courtyard eruv. Excuse me. Abaye said to Rabbah, well, what if there are 5 houses in a courtyard and they make a courtyard eruv? So all 5 houses make their separate contributions to the courtyard eruv. And then that courtyard gets joined with another courtyard, a neighboring courtyard, right? So there's 2 courtyards and there's a doorway between them, and they're going to join these courtyards so that on Shabbos, people can carry objects not only in and out of their houses in their own courtyards, but also between the courtyards. So now, for the purposes of this new eruv, like the master eruv, and let's say that in each of the courtyards, right, there's 5 houses in 2 courtyards. Each courtyard has 5 houses. And in each of the courtyards, everybody contributed to the courtyard eruv. Now we want to join the courtyards. Do each of the 5 people in the first courtyard, do they have to now contribute again to this new eruv, which is going to join the courtyards? Abaye asks Rabbah. Rabbah says, no, it's enough that the 5 houses that already joined in an eruv, as a unit, they send one piece of food, right? One contribution to this master eruv that's going to, this bigger eruv that's going to join the 2 courtyards, and they don't have to make independent contributions to that. So Abaye says, okay, so in that case, why is it that the brothers need to make separate contributions? Aren't they like 5 houses in a courtyard that have joined, that are now joined in one eruv and are now just going to send one piece of food over to join with the neighboring courtyard? And Rabbah says, because it's not the same situation, because the brothers share a courtyard with other residents, not of some other courtyard, but in their own courtyard. And since the residents of their own courtyard would restrict them from carrying, if those people didn't join in the eruv, likewise, the brothers are considered individuals since they eat and sleep in their own houses, really since they eat in their own houses. And so even though they get their food from their dad, they need to make their own contribution. And the final proof of how we know that a person's residence is where he eats, not where he sleeps, is because when we make an eruv tehumin, right, when we move our residence in order to be able to walk further in one direction or the other, right, because I can only walk 2,000 cubits from my residence on Shabbos, and if I want to go somewhere that's 3,000 cubits away to get to my friend's house for lunch, let's say, before Shabbos begins, I need to change the location of my dwelling. And how do I do that? I deposit some food in a basket somewhere between me and my friend's house 3,000 cubits away. And so I establish a Shabbos dwelling with food, right? Which is we discussed many times when we were discussing, moving the Shabbos boundary, making an eruv tehumin. And so it clearly, Shabbos dwelling is determined by where a person eats rather than where he sleeps. That completes our discussion of Mishnah number 5. Now we're going to open our discussion of Mishnah number 6, and then I'm going to get to comments and questions. Mishnah number 6. If 5 courtyards open into one another and also open into an alleyway. So that is this situation. There are 5 courtyards. They all open into an alleyway and they open into each other. That's the key. So they have an option. And there's at least 2 houses in every courtyard. And to leave the courtyard, every courtyard has an option. They can either exit by way of the alley and get out to the main road or to the rest of the city, or they can exit out into the neighboring courtyard. So in this situation, so I'll just keep this up there while I read. If 5 courtyards open into one another and also open into an alleyway, the following distinctions apply. If the residents of the courtyard established an eruv in the courtyards and did not merge the courtyards that open into the alleyway, they are permitted to carry in the courtyards and they are prohibited to carry in the alleyway. See, it's possible to, first of all, make an eruv in each courtyard, so that the houses have to make an eruv for each of the courtyards. And then it's possible, because they're open to each other, to join the courtyards without merging all of the courtyards with respect to the alleyway. So it would be possible to carry even from here to there. They could go through these open doorways and they could all join these courtyards without necessarily merging the courtyards with respect to the alley. That's a separate procedure. If they merge all the courtyards with respect to the alley, then carrying is going to be permitted not on Shabbos, not only between the courtyards through these open doors, but also through the alley. And carrying will be permitted in the alley on Shabbos. If they only join the courtyards by joining baskets of food, but sort of in light of the fact that there's doors between them, then carrying would not be permitted in the alleyway. Carrying is only going to be permitted in the alleyway if they merge the courtyards with respect to the alleyway. So, if they established an eruv of the courtyards, in other words, joined the courtyards through the open doorways in between them, and did not merge the courtyards with respect to the alleyway, then they would be permitted to carry in the courtyards, but prohibited to carry in the alleyway. The eruv they established cannot also serve as a merging of the courtyards with respect to the alleyway. And if they merge the courtyards of the alleyway, right, merge with respect to the alleyway, then they are permitted to carry both here and there. In other words, if they didn't make joining of courtyards, but rather they did merging of all the courtyards with respect to the alleyway, then they would be permitted to carry in the alleyway and say go through the alleyway to carry something to a neighboring courtyard, and also to carry through these open doorways. Merging everything with respect to the alleyway would cover carrying between the courtyards through these open doors. But joining the courtyards for carrying through the open doors would not render the alleyway permitted for carrying on Shabbos. That's a separate procedure that you would need to do. And if they established an eruv in the courtyards and also merged the courtyards of the alleyway, and one of the residents of the courtyard forgot and did not contribute to the eruv in his courtyard, but did participate in the merging of the courtyards in the alleyway, then they are permitted both here and there, right? So let's say that this guy right here forgot to join his eruv, right? He forgot to make an eruv with this other house. But he did contribute to a merging of all the courtyards and the alleyway, so he's going to be covered by that merging of the alleyway, and he can carry throughout this whole area, even though he forgot to join the eruv in his own courtyard. However, if the residents of the alleyway forgot and didn't participate in the merging of the alleyway, in the merging of the courtyards of the alleyway, then they would be permitted to carry in the courtyards, but not in the alleyway. And an alleyway is to courtyards. An alleyway is to courtyards as a courtyard is to houses. Meaning that if, let's say, all of these courtyards merged with respect to the alleyway, but this courtyard did not participate in the merging of the alleyway, since they have the right to carry in, to walk through the alleyway, they would restrict the alleyway, even though these 4 courtyards not just join their courtyards, but joined in a merger with respect to the alleyway. So then the purpose of that is so everyone could carry through the alleyway and in the alleyway. But if one of the courtyards didn't join, it wouldn't work. The merging wouldn't work, and no one could carry in the alleyway or through the alleyway unless the courtyard that failed to join in the merging of the courtyards with respect to the alleyway renounced their rights in the alleyway. Then it would allow everyone else to carry in the alleyway. Okay, that's our Mishnah. Woo. Okay, so an eruv joining courtyards with openings does not permit carrying in the alleyway, but merging courtyards of an alleyway does cover the joined courtyard. So even if one forgot to join the eruv in his own courtyard, but did contribute to the merging of courtyards in the alleyway, he would be good to carry. And then I just explained how one would restrict everyone else from carrying the alleyway if a particular resident or particular courtyard didn't join in the merger of the alleyway. Rabbi Meir says, if you have this situation, because clearly the question we would then ask is, okay, well, if you merge all the courtyards so that they can carry in the alley, and then that would cover carrying between the courtyards, why would we bother to also do a joining of courtyards? Why would we bother? In fact, why would we even make an eruv within a courtyard? Because if we did this merger with respect to the whole alleyway, we just learned that even if somebody didn't contribute to the eruv in their own courtyard, they would still be permitted to carry through this whole space. So why not just make sure that everybody merges all the courtyards with respect to the alleyway, and they're done? Everyone contributes to an eruv just for the purpose of merging all the courtyards in the alleyway. They put this side post at the opening of the alleyway, and now everybody can carry throughout the alley, throughout the courtyards, between courtyards. It's done. Why would they also need to make an eruv inside each courtyard? And Rabbi Meir says we obligate that so that people don't forget the law of eruv. We obligate them to do it so that over the generations, the neighbors have to deal with each other, have to work together, have to contribute to courtyard eruvs, and that law of how to do that doesn't get forgotten over time. Rav Yehuda said that Rav taught this law without these openings between the courtyards. Why? Because what he wanted to accomplish is that people would be seen walking out of a courtyard and into a courtyard to collect food and back to the alley and into the next courtyard to collect food from that courtyard and back and out and back and out. And that we see that somebody is always walking through the alleyway to collect food from each courtyard in order to accomplish the merging of the alleyways. Well, okay, so we get that, but do we actually have to do that? Because what if the case is like this? There are openings between the courtyards. Can the one who is collecting food in order to make a merger of courtyards with respect to the alleyway, does he have to walk through the alleyway, or can he just walk directly between the courtyards? Do we accomplish a merging of courtyards with respect to the alleyway if he doesn't ever walk through the alleyway, but rather just goes through the openings and the fences between the courtyards? And to answer that question, tune in on Friday. There will not be class tomorrow. I'm going to be out of town tomorrow afternoon, just outside LA. So that's why we had a double class today. And to find out, to merge courtyards with respect to the alleyway, must the person collecting the food walk through the alleyway? We'll get to that question on Friday. All right, let's look at your comments and questions today. Sharon Frant Brooks comments, since the eruv is based on food, wouldn't it make sense that where you eat determine your Shabbos dwelling? Exactly. You got it. That's exactly right. Okay, and it seems like I'm receiving the message that there's no other questions or comments. Okay, this was not an easy class. There was a lot of, ideation that you have to sort of keep track of different concepts that are coming one after another pretty fast. Hopefully it wasn't too overwhelming. But on Friday, we'll continue with a much more clearly defined question. To join the courtyards that empty into an alley, must we walk through the alley? My friends, have a great evening. Have a great Thursday. And with God's help, we'll be together again on Friday at the regular time, which is noon Pacific.